Welcome back, my daisy cakes. We are continuing my list of top 100 science fiction authors. Yes, I've curated a list of 100 of my favorite science fiction authors. Why? Because I am Daisy Ex Machina, the drag queen detective who investigates all things speculative in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And this is part 3 of a 10-part series. Today we start with Michael Crichton, who was born in 1942 and died in 2008 at the age of 66. Growing up, he was very self-conscious of his height. He was 6'9". That's 206 centimeters for you Europeans. But he was always interested in writing. His experience, however, in the literature department at Harvard was not good. And he changed his major to biological anthropology, which maybe he was able to use for a few of his books. He graduated summa cum laude in 1964, and in the mid-60s he wrote pulp crime novels under the pseudonym John Lang. His first science fiction novel, and the first one published under his name, was in 1969 with The Andromeda Strain, which I still think is one of his best works. It's about a satellite that crashes to Earth and carries with it an extraterrestrial virus. But you may know him from a little novel he published in 1990 called Jurassic Park. This, of course, became a movie directed by Steven Spielberg, but Crichton also directed a few movies of his own, including one based on his historical novel, The Great Train Robbery. Oh, and you may think he wrote Coma, but that was written by his friend Robin Cook. But Crichton wrote the screenplay and directed the movie. And this is not much of a surprise to me because I think his writing style is very cinematic. And by that, I mean reading his works feels like watching a movie, which I think is why many of his novels have been successfully adapted to the big screen, and it's a style I think a few authors have, including Stephen King, but he wasn't that well respected among some serious science fiction authors, like, for example, Philip K. Dick. But Crichton has had quite a big impact on pop culture, and I'd argue has helped make science fiction more welcome in the mainstream. The next author you know would be on this list. Of course he would be, because I'm talking about Sir Arthur C. Clarke, the English author born in 1917 and died in 2008 at the age of 90. He was known as one of the big three in science fiction during his heyday, along with Robert Heinlein and Isaac Asimov. Clarke grew up reading pulp science fiction magazines and had an early interest in astronomy. He served as a radar specialist in the Royal Air Force during World War II and later got a degree in mathematics and physics from King's College. Clarke is the epitome of a hard science fiction writer where the science is the feature of the stories. His first full novel, which was based on an earlier novella, was The City in the Stars, and he followed that with maybe my favorite of Clarke's works, Childhood's End, about first contact with the mysterious race of beings known as the Overlords. Are the Overlords benign? Are they malicious? Why do they never show themselves to humans? It's great, thought-provoking stuff. And by the way, the novel 2001: A Space Odyssey, which he wrote for the movie, is not that great in my opinion, and it's not a good one for people to start with. Go ahead and start with Childhood's End. Many of his speculations were very prescient, especially concerning telecommunication satellites and the World Wide Web. Personally, I'm still waiting for a space elevator. Let's jump to a much more contemporary author. Known for her young adult novels, I am talking about Suzanne Collins and The Hunger Games. Born in 1962, she started her writing career in television, working for Nickelodeon in the early 90s. Her first books were, naturally, children's books. or middle grade books as publishing calls them, with the fantasy series known as the Underland Chronicles, which starts with the book Gregor the Overlander. She followed that with The Hunger Games in 2008, the first young adult book in the Hunger Games trilogy, which includes Catching Fire and Mockingjay. Of course, you know they became blockbuster movies, but they were also best-selling books, and for good reason. Don't let young adult put you off. This is a really good dystopian story set in the aftermath of some apocalyptic event where humanity is divided into a very hierarchical structure with the elite class living in the capital, and everyone else is divided among the districts who basically serve to produce for the elite in the capital. To appease the masses, there is a bread and circuses event known as the Hunger Games, where young people fight to the death, and the winners get to come home as heroes. Katniss Everdeen is our main character who joins the Hunger Games so her younger sister doesn't have to go. I thought these were well written and creative, and I even liked the prequel, and I never like prequels, but The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, published in 2020, is an anti-hero story about the man who would become the dictator, who was involved in the prototype of the Hunger Games. The next author wrote books that appealed to every goth gay kid in the 80s, and that's Storm Constantine and the Rathru trilogy. She's a British author born in 1956 and died in 2021 at the age of 64. She was very involved in the goth culture of the 80s, especially embracing the aesthetic of androgyny. Her first novel, which was the first in the Rathru trilogy, was The Enchantments of Flesh and Spirit, published in 1987, followed by The Bewitchments of Love and Hate, and concludes with The Fulfillments of Fate and Desire. She would later write more books in the Rathru universe, but these first three are what I think are must-reads. The books tell the story of a post-apocalyptic era where humanity has just evolved into a new race of androgynous beings of Rathru who are born of human parents, but they live much longer lives. And they stop aging as teenagers. The trilogy follows the first of the Rathru as they work to carve out a place in this new society and create new social structures in the ruins of human civilization. The stories, I think, are literary and reflect Storm Constantine's interests in the occult and esoteric spiritualities. James S. A. Corey is not an author. They are two authors, Daniel Abraham and Ty Frank. And they are known for one thing, but it's a big thing, The Expanse. The 9-book series starts with Leviathan Wakes, published in 2011, and concludes with Leviathan Falls, published in 2021. It is an amazing science fiction epic set in the future when humans have conquered the solar system. There's no interstellar travel, but they've developed a fusion drive called the Epstein drive that allows for continuous acceleration, and there are settlers on Mars as well as the asteroid belt. The politics are complicated. Earth and Mars are apparently continuously on the brink of war, and those who live in the asteroid belt, the Belters, continuously struggle to survive. The story starts as a detective story with a gumshoe named Joe Miller, who's hired to find the daughter of a rich family back on Earth. This leads him to uncover an alien substance known as a protomolecule, discovered and studied in secret by a mega corporation that is now in way over their heads. The story starts really small, and with each novel, it grows and grows. The politics, the characters, the story, it is all huge and epic, and the type of science fiction that I really love. And it was made into a really great science fiction series, started by the Sci-Fi Channel and then completed by Amazon Prime. The next author is one you probably only know as an editor, Lester Del Rey. He was born in 1915 and died in 1993, and I am sure you've probably heard of Del Rey Books, which is the publishing imprint of Ballantine, later Random House, that specializes in science fiction books. When the imprint was founded, it was with Lester Del Rey and his wife Judy Lynn Del Rey as the editors. But Lester Del Rey started as a writer, selling stories to the pulp magazines in the 30s and 40s, like Robert Heinlein and Andre Norton. His first novels were juvenile science fiction novels. He later wrote many other novels, but he never really took off as a writer. At least I didn't know his writing until I ran across a copy of a book in a used bookstore called Attack from Atlantis, published in 1953. And because I was really familiar with Del Rey, the imprint, I was kind of curious about Lester Del Rey, the writer, so I immediately picked up the book. I believe it was one of his juvenile books because the main character was 17 years old. He somehow was on the crew of a deep-sea nuclear submarine named the Triton. And yes, the Triton found the lost civilization of Atlantis. Now, the Atlanteans are very high-tech and have force fields and can control dinosaur-sized creatures. And for some reason, they mistake the dog that's kind of the mascot on the submarine as a god. So the crew of the Triton are imprisoned on Atlantis and must work out how to escape. It's not a bad story. It's fun. It was a glimpse into the mind of the editor who would be the midwife to many great books and the careers of many great authors. An interesting thing about the Del Rey imprint is his wife, Judy Lynn, who was born with dwarfism, may have been the better editor, at least according to Philip K. Dick, who said she was the best editor he ever worked with and called her a master craftsman. Moving on, we come to Samuel R. Delaney, another of my favorites. Delaney was born in 1942 and at one time was pretty much known as the only African-American science fiction writer. He was first published in 1962 with the novel The Jewels of Aptor. He continued publishing novels and honing his craft, gaining recognition in the sci-fi community until Babel 17 came out in 1966, which won the Nebula Award for Best Novel, tied with Flowers for Algernon, and was also nominated for the Hugo. Babel 17 is one I highly recommend, especially as an introduction to Delaney. It's about a Chinese starship captain named Rida Wong, who is also a telepath who must learn the language of an alien race that is invading human civilization. It's a really interesting exploration into how language shapes thought and perception. Since then, he's written many great science fiction novels like Nova and Triton, but my absolute favorite is his magnum opus called Science Fiction's Version of Ulysses because of its density. I am talking about Dahlgren, published in 1975. This is a really hard novel to get into because there really is no plot. It's a hallucinatory slice of life reflecting the author's queerness and psychedelic perception of timelessness. Again, this is not a novel for everyone, which is why I'm not really recommending it. But like many who have read it, I am a huge fan. Okay, I've already mentioned him twice in this video, so now we come to the man himself, Philip K. Dick, born in 1953 and died very young at the age of 53 in 1982, just 4 months before the release of Blade Runner, the very well-regarded movie based on one of Dick's stories. I have a confession to make. I find Philip K. Dick's writing hard to get into. For me, just for me, I don't find his writing very accessible, so he's not my favorite writer, but I have read many of his works. His first novel was published in 1955 called Solar Lottery. He continued to write through that decade and apparently lost several manuscripts, ergo the lost manuscripts of Philip K. Dick. He became well known in the science fiction circles after The Man in the High Castle won the Hugo in 1963, which posited what if the Axis powers won World War II and split America between the Nazis and the Japanese Empire. His stories are psychedelic and reflect Dick's very complicated life that includes struggles with mental illness, drugs, and apparently the very real surveillance by the U.S. government. For my recommendation, it would have to be Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, published in 1968, which Blade Runner is based on. But if you want to explore his more difficult and personal writing, I'd recommend Valise. Valise was published in 1981 and is the name of either a satellite or a movie or an alien space probe. You have to read it to understand. I know I'm going to get some flack about my next author because he is mostly known for his fantasy, and that is Stephen R. Donaldson. I know he's known for the epic adult, very adult fantasy, The Thomas Covenant Chronicles, which started with Lord Fal's Bane, published in 1977. I liked those at the time when they were published, but it's a hard one for some people to get into because the main character is basically a rapist. But even more intense than that is what I think is his best work, the 5-volume science fiction epic, The Gap Cycle, which starts with The Gap into Conflict, the real story, published in 1991, and ends with The Gap into Ruin, This Day All Gods Die, published in 1996. This is the epitome of space opera because it is not only set in the far, far future when humanity has spread through the galaxy, but is based on an actual opera, Wagner's Ring Cycle. This is an extremely dark story and has all the trigger warnings you'll find in Lord Fal's Bane turned up to an 11. And none of the characters are likable, but the story is so fascinating, so raw, so dark, so intense. There are 3 main players: Morn Highland, who is kind of a policewoman in space, Angus Thermopylae, a brutal space pirate, and a swashbuckling hero who is not really a hero, named Nick Sicurso. Throughout the series, as humanity is threatened by an alien race, it's never clear who are the heroes and who are the villains, or if the roles flip-flop. I wish more people knew about this series, but my suspicion is that fans of Donaldson's fantasy weren't interested in science fiction, and fans of science fiction, at least at the time these books were published, weren't interested in multi-book epics. But if you think you might be interested in really dark, brutal, disturbing space operas, check out The Gap Cycle. The last author in this list is Diane Duane, born in 1952. She left her job where she worked as a psychiatric nurse in 1976 to move to California and become an assistant to David Gerrold. If that name sounds familiar, he got his start in the original Star Trek as a scriptwriter and eventually turned into an award-winning novelist. Anyway, Diane Duane first published in 1979 an epic fantasy called The Door into Fire, the first in the Middle Kingdom series. It wasn't that successful. What was more successful was her young adult series called The Young Wizards that starts with, so you want to be a wizard. But the reason she is here in this science fiction list, now remember, I said she started as an assistant to David Gerrold, who was associated with Star Trek, and I don't know how much this connection played in her career, but she became known, at least how I knew her, for her Star Trek novels. The first being The Wounded Sky, published in 1983, but my favorite is Spock's World, published in 1988, which I think is one of the best Star Trek novels ever published. It picks up on the storyline of Amok Time in the original series, where Spock is engaged to a conniving Vulcan named T'Pring. In Spock's World, T'Pring is now the leader of a Vulcan faction seeking to separate itself from the Federation because they claim that contact with the emotions of humans is corrupting the Vulcan race. We are back with the 3 main characters of the original series, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. McCoy gets some great screen time or page time. We get lots of Vulcan politics and lots of Sarek and Amanda. I'm not the only one who fell in love with this Star Trek novel. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 8 weeks. So those are the next 10 science fiction authors in my list. Have you read any of these authors, or do you want to read them? Let me know down in the comments, and while you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Also, I am simultaneously doing a list of 100 fantasy authors, so keep an eye out for those videos. Until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.